Well, it's great to be with you. My name is John. If we haven't met yet, I'm one of the pastors here at Riverwood. Whether you're here with us at the factory, at the warehouse, at the fire hall, or tuning in online, just a joy to be with you. Well, just a short 20 kilometers north of Orangeville in Dufferin County, Ontario, is where my dad grew up and where we used to go as kids and visit every year growing up. But there is our own Canadian story of a lost treasure. Jesse James, the infamous Wild West outlaw, responsible for a number of high-profile robberies in the 19th century, is the subject of legends. The outlaw is believed to have buried a large amount of gold near Mulmer, Ontario, which has never been found. According to the story, Jesse James was on the run in 1870 after robbing a Wells Fargo train that had gone sideways. With the authorities on his tail, James and his comrades, known as the James Younger Gang, headed north with all of their loot, a gold cache estimated to be worth about $4 million Canadian. And there was a man who went by the name of Mr. Richardson who arrived in Princeton, Ontario in the early 1880s and settled into a nearby hotel. And at the very same time, a relatively poor blacksmith named John Bailey suddenly came into this wealth and built this expensive home with stained glass windows, which James's gang is rumored to have paid for with silver dollars. In fact, the Wells Fargo loot reportedly included $45,000 in silver dollars. Well, fast forward 2 years later, when Jesse James was killed, his portrait was splashed across local newspapers everywhere, and residents in Princeton, Ontario immediately recognized him as the infamous Mr. Richardson, a fictitious name Jesse James had used to elude U.S. authorities. It's thought that James buried the massive gold cache that he had captured from Wells Fargo in Mulmer, Ontario, about 2 hours north of Princeton, where he is rumored to have built his home. Somewhere along the 10th side road between Mansfield and Masonville, you will find the farmhouse, and if you're lucky, very lucky, you'll even find Jesse James gold. Well, when I hear these stories, there's something in me that is so intrigued. I just want to hop in my car and set out on the adventure to search for these. I actually think it's a little bit genetic for me. In fact, living very close to this supposed site of the barrel of gold of Jesse James is my Uncle Joe, who quite literally has been a treasure hunter for much of his career. Not so much in the quest for buried treasure, but discovering unrealized value and opportunities. I remember when I was younger, I was always full of intrigue and admiration, and often fascinated listening to the stories that he would tell. You see, my Uncle Joe is an auctioneer. We loved going to his auctions and listening to him dominate this little portable PA system, calling out the auctions, and would find ourselves suddenly being sucked into this quest for a deal ourselves and bidding on some items. I still love going to auctions, but I've had to curb this habit because I've always end up bidding on things I had no need for just because they were a steal of a deal. But my uncle began as an auctioneer and then eventually spent much of his life actually heading out searching for the treasures himself. He would buy up estates, he would buy up storage lockers or go to garage sales. In fact, he'd buy things on the buy and sell just to step into someone's house and then begin to make deals with things that he would see around him. Often ended up leaving with much more than he came for. Well, I was actually just chatting with him this week and he told me the story about going to a garage sale recently and he bought this 7-inch vase on sale for about $15. And he went to auction and sold it for $4,820. I mean, I also remember this story he shared about buying up an entire house estate. He was interested in it because they had all these old oil signs and antiques and thought they would have value. And so he bought this entire estate. But between the time he bought it and when he got access to it, it was clear that some of the relatives came back and had really taken quite a bit away from the estate. And so as he went into the house to discover what he might find was still left, he went up to the bedroom and right on the bedside table, he started looking through these books. The first one he opened up was literally packed full of $20 bills. that were hidden inside it. And he gave the second book to my aunt to look through. And this one was full of bills too, but this one was 50s and hundreds. And in total, they counted $13,000 worth of cash that was untouched. Now, if you've been tracking with us, we've been on our chapter a day journey as a church, making our way through the entire New Testament. And recently we turned our pages to the book of Romans. And over this past couple of weeks, we've set out on our own quest for lost or hidden treasures we might discover in this letter that Paul wrote to the church in Rome. Treasures buried under decades or even centuries of neglect. Treasures that have perhaps been stolen or hidden, or maybe even just lost through centuries of morphing language. Well, today we continue on our quest together to see if maybe there are some more valuable items lurking in these pages for us. And to remind us, Romans was a letter written by Paul to the church in Rome. And he was writing to a church that had found themselves with two somewhat divided groups within the church. Two groups of people that were sort of digging their heels into the dirt and holding much too tightly onto their traditions or the way that things were supposed to be or what they knew. And stuck in the paradigms of how they were seeing the world, but coming from very different perspectives. First, you have many of them who were Jewish believers coming from their traditions of Judaism and all that they knew as a way of life and faith. And then on the other side were those coming from the surrounding nations, especially from Greek and Roman culture. And they have this whole different paradigm of how they think about or see God. On the one hand, there were those who thought, hey, we are the Jews. We are God's chosen people. We have been given and we adhere to God's Mosaic law. This is our identity, maybe even with a sense of status with God that others don't have. And on the other hand, you have those that were coming from the surrounding nations, Greeks and Romans, and ingrained in their worldview was this pantheon, this idea that there are many gods out there that don't really care about you, gods who serve themselves, and your whole opportunity in life is to try and make sure you please them so you might get something out of them. And what's happened in our discovery over these past couple of weeks is that Paul has been revealing to both of these listeners that within ourselves, we don't possess a righteousness on our own that would allow us to approach or stand in the presence of a holy God. That because of our sin, because of our rebellion, we find ourselves lost in the despair of our sinfulness. And that any argument that we in and of ourselves can achieve through our own efforts, a way back to being on measure with God, that none of these arguments would hold up. And over these past couple of weeks, we've dug hard into discovering the lost treasures of understanding both our sinfulness and the wrath of God. And if you kind of double take on what I just said because you missed the past couple of weeks, I'd encourage you to go back and to watch them. And so Paul's writing to both of these groups, the Jewish believers and the Greek and Roman believers, and centering them both around this reality that no one, for the Gentile, no matter how hard they try to appease the God that they serve, or for the Jew, no matter how much they think they've been granted some sort of status with God or that they can earn it in keeping the law that they had been given, no one of themselves can achieve what is needed to be right with God. Listen to the words in Romans chapter 3, verse 9. It says, well then, should we conclude that we Jews are better than others? No, not at all, for we've already shown that all people, whether Jews or Gentiles, are under the same power of sin. As the scriptures say, no one is righteous, not even one. No one is truly wise. No one is seeking God. All have turned away. All have become useless. No one does good, not a single one. What Paul is saying to them and what Paul is saying to us is that no matter how hard we try, we do not earn or buy or happen our way into being in a right relationship with our Creator. But rather, Paul says, the pathway we take is found another way. And in Romans 3, verses 21 and 22, I think we may discover the lost treasure that I want to spend some time searching for today. In verse 21, it says, but now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus to all who believe. Today, the treasure we want to search for is not so much a word or a concept that's been forgotten or lost. In fact, I think it's much the opposite. The quest we take today is more to recover some of the meaning that has been lost, maybe in its overuse, or maybe the way in which language has shifted, as has the world in which we read it through. Faith was a critical concept for Paul in his writings. It's used 40 times in the letter he wrote to the Romans. And here we hear Paul say to both of these groups, the only hope we have to being made right with God is not through any of our own efforts, not what you were born into, but it is through faith. Now, when you hear this word, what comes to mind? Take a second to think about it. There are probably not too many words we use as commonly in the church as this word faith. And so when you hear it or you say it, what does it mean? I kind of think this is one of those terms that's like an elastic word. It stretches and can be used with such a wide range of meaning. It's one of those words that we all assume to know what it means, but maybe without really knowing it. Perhaps we just know where to use it more than anything. I mean, the Jets are down by 2 with 4 minutes left. Hold on to the faith. We use faith as some sort of desperate or optimistic hope, something we cling on to. Or we might say, I'm a person of faith. Faith is referred to maybe as this blanket term for religions or people of all faiths, so that faith is any sort of a belief in the supernatural or the spiritual. Maybe faith can be seen as something of a sort of a spiritual ability to bring about miraculous or mysterious things. That person has so much faith. What does that mean when you hear it? So when you hear Paul say that righteousness, our way of being made right with God, is given through faith in Jesus Christ, what surfaces? Is faith here maybe an emotional response we have towards Jesus? Is faith to believe something, to believe it correctly? Is faith because you believe something you can't see? Or is faith an action, or is it more of a sentiment, something that you feel? Is faith an event, or is it something that's ongoing? Well, in a few minutes, we will get out a few of our treasure hunting tools and begin to peruse the books on the bedside table to see if we might be able to discover some things that maybe have been hidden or overlooked, and to see what observations we can find. So let's return to these words in Romans 3:21 and 22, as Paul writes to both the Jews and the Gentiles in the Church of Rome, as he reminds them of how it is that we are made right with God, not by our own efforts or merit, but by what Paul calls faith. In verse 21, but now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. And in verse 22, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. Now, if we're going to discover any treasures here, we're going to have to do a bit of searching. On the surface, these words roll off the tongue and feel familiar enough for our ears that maybe we even struggle to see what meaning could actually be missed. But what I think we need to do is attempt for a moment to see if we can hear these words as if we lived in the first century world Paul was writing to, which can sometimes prove to be a tricky task. On our quest today, this has led me to what I will call observation number 1. We have no words. A number of years ago, I had the remarkable opportunity to hike the ancient Inca trail through the remote mountains in Peru that lead to Machu Picchu, a 15th century citadel carved into the top of a mountain 2,500 meters high. It was a journey I shared with a couple of my closest friends. It was one of the more significant experiences of my life. It was a 4-day journey that marked our lives together in a profound way. What's interesting is that it feels like every time we've attempted to describe what this experience meant to us, words seem to fall short to anyone else. We try, but eyes sort of begin to gloss over, and I'm quite certain our other friends are very sick of hearing about it by now. And yet we revisit it together often because in the context of our shared experience, we can recapture the meaning it held for us. Well, I think in many ways, our attempt to recover what Paul speaks to the church here in Romans is the same experience. Faith. How we use this word falls significantly short to what I think would have been understood in the context it was spoken. In the Greek language, the word that Paul uses here and throughout the entire book of Romans is the word pistis. And the reality is that pistis has no full English equivalent. There's no modern word you and I can find that fully captures what it meant. In Greek mythology, pistis was the personification of trustworthiness. It was not simply a transactional word, but more of a social term, actually. It was a term that found its home in the relational idea of trust. Pistis, often rendered as belief or faith in our New Testament, should probably be rendered more in terms of a vow to a faithful relationship, to capture the understanding that the early church would have had. If we contrast the world we live in to the world Paul was writing to, it gives us some helpful insight. When we talk about faith or belief in English, we are talking about something very intellectual, I think. A claim that thinking something is true. In the world we're in, we have plenty of people who I'd identify as maybe atheist or agnostic, not really believing in anything supernatural. But this was not the case to whom Paul was writing. Essentially, everyone held a worldview that there were many gods within their domain. And that depending on what outcome you might want, you would try to appease one of them or have a loyalty to a number of them. And so then when we understand pistis in terms of a vow of faithfulness or a covenant of loyalty, it frames the entire concept differently than what we might understand it to mean. We might think in terms of convincing somebody of a belief, but there it would have meant a vow of loyalty, a change of allegiances from one of the many gods to what Paul was calling the one true God. It was a turning of your life with a commitment of allegiance. And so you have this word in ancient Greek that's not so much a cognitive understanding as it was a relational term. It encapsulated trust or faithfulness, loyalty, fidelity, commitment. It found its home housed in the concept of a covenant or a vow, a word that carried much strength and weight. And so as we struggle in our English language to adequately convey the context or weight of its meaning, in our New Testaments, it's commonly translated as belief or faith, and yet it kind of falls short, especially when we bring the paradigm of our scientific, data-driven worldview to it and essentially end up applying the concept of a belief or a cognitive convincing to the concept of faith. When we consider the context for Paul's letter even further, we understand that Paul is using pistis framed in the entire history of Israel in the concept of covenant. God had chosen the Israelites as the nation that he would bring about salvation and light to the rest of the world. He had made a covenant relationship with them. And yet Paul says back in verse 1 that they were not able to keep what? Faithful pistis to bring it about. And of course, we know that to be the constant story of the Old Testament, Israel struggling to remain faithful. And then we come to verse 22 and we read that the righteousness, being made right with God, is given through pistis, through faith in Jesus to all who believe. What Paul literally wrote was that righteousness is given through pistis Christou, which actually is translated not as faith in Jesus, but rather through the faithfulness of Jesus for all who believe. Do you see this? The idea of pistis is framed wholly within this idea of a covenant relationship between us and God. Israel was not capable of remaining faithful to this covenant. And Paul actually says, none of us are. But the good news he was speaking of is it actually was Jesus who steps in and fulfills this covenant where we couldn't. It was his Pistis, his faithfulness, and it is there in which we find ourselves restored into this relationship with God. That is the faith that Paul writes about. That is Pistis. It is us responding to Jesus' faithfulness, not simply with a mindset change or a belief, but with our own faithfulness, with our own whole heart and life and trust. It's not simply a belief, but it's an allegiance of our life. It's prompted many to adapt the language that when we use it in the New Testament to understanding faith and belief in Jesus more in terms of our faithfulness or our loyalty or our commitment rather than simply a cognitive sense of belief or trust. And so observation number one is that we have no words. Observation number two, focus makes a difference. How many of you would say that focus is a strength of yours? Well, I want to put you to the test. I'm going to play a short video and I want you to see if you can count the number of times the players that are wearing white pass the ball and see in all the movement if you can actually get the number right. Okay, so the correct answer is 16 passes. Now, how many of you saw the gorilla walk through the frame? Now, some of you may have heard of this video before, but for those who haven't, about half of everyone that watches it don't spot the gorilla at all. Now, maybe you saw the gorilla, but did you notice that the curtain was changing color? Or that the player on the black team left the screen? Let me rewind it for you to see it again. So here is the gorilla, and then there goes the player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. Now, this is a phenomenon called inattentional blindness. Essentially, when we focus on one aspect, we can often become blind to another. Now, what you may not know about the passage we have been looking at today is that this passage has been marked with quite a heated debate for the past 600 years or even longer. Now, thank goodness I'm here to clear it all up for you today. Well, of course, I kid with you, but I do think it's helpful for us to understand this and how it relates to my observation that our focus makes a difference. Essentially, the debate centers around something that I've already referenced. It's Paul's use of this phrase, pistis Christou. In the NIV translation of our passage, we read it earlier and it says this: the righteousness is given through pistis Christou, faith in Jesus Christ. Now compare that with another translation, this one from the Voice. It says this: the redeeming justice or righteousness comes through the faithfulness of Jesus, who makes salvation a reality for all who believe. And even when we dig back into the older King James, we find the same translation referring to the faithfulness of Jesus versus faith in Jesus. Essentially, the debate is whether or not this noun should be treated as an objective genitive, resulting in a translation of faith in Christ, or as a subjective genitive, then translated as the faithfulness of Christ. Now, before I lose you all in a grammar lesson, you might be thinking, big deal, both kind of sound the same. But here's why I share this. The grammatical debate was at the center of a major shift in the history of our Christian faith. In the 16th century was this movement we know as the Reformation, a movement which brought about the versions of the Protestant Christian worldview that by and large we have been built on. Martin Luther was at the lead of this Reformation, reacting to the world around him in which much of the control of our faith was held in the structures of the church. Our forgiveness or our salvation or our understanding of God was done through the structures of priests, and it was about doing or saying the right things for us to achieve them. And so Luther leads this revolution that shifts the landscape of the entire Christian church, giving the common man access to the scriptures for themselves. And from this movement has emerged what we know today as sola fide, which means faith alone. That our salvation comes through faith alone and not through our works or through penance or through the acts of the priests of the church. This movement was foundational, and from it is where much of the language that we use in our own theology emerged from, and where the Protestant denominations we all know find their roots. And so hinged in this verse in Romans chapter 3 and a few others is this phrase, Pistis Christou. It was at the center of debate, and we can clearly see that most of our translations today have favored the translation that best reflect this movement that Martin Luther led. Allow me to read you a part of the research that I found this past week looking into this. It says this: the debate hinges upon the translation of a simple two-word Greek phrase, Pistis Christou. In short, if the Christou in Pistis Christou is an objective genitive, faith in Christ, then Luther was right, and Protestant theology since Luther has generally been on the right track so far as this issue is concerned. If, however, the Christou in Pistis Christou is the subjective genitive, the faithfulness of Christ, then Luther got it all wrong, and that Protestant theology since Luther has generally been on the wrong track. Thus, the difference between faith in and the faithfulness of Christ is important because it goes to the very root of one of the major issues that sparked the Protestant Reformation. Now, these are heavy words that seem to suggest much hangs in the balance in the way we conjugate a single word in the scriptures. And if you're asking me, I think this guy probably liked hearing the sound of his own voice a little too much, and that this is far too dramatic of a conclusion. However, I do think it highlights something for us that I believe can be seen as the shortcoming of our modern day Western church and its general bent towards this ultra individualistic, event-based, sort of cerebral understanding of our faith. There's been a movement as of late in the past maybe 20 to 30 years, it's begun to look a little more critically at some of the outcomes of the Reformation in shaping the church and working very hard to attempt to recapture and revisit the world of the first century church, to attempt to understand it more meaningfully. Much of the language of the kingdom of God that has become so commonplace in our language has emerged from this work. Now, back to how this idea of focus overlays. In very crass terms, this polarizing debate was between this idea of whether it was our works or our faith that was the catalyst for being made right with God, for our salvation. The Reformation was by and large a major and necessary reaction, but it also leaves within it the potential that in this reaction, as most of us tend to do, even on a societal level, it swings too far. Martin Luther, in his zeal to undermine and cast down the indulgence and merit systems of the church, may have sent the pendulum swinging in the opposite extreme. With this reaction, it's brought into focus the important learnings that we do not earn our way into right relationship with God. And there's no question about that. But as we've zeroed in on it so intently, we may be blinded to reading our scriptures in a pretty one-dimensional way. Just as the gorilla walked across the street unnoticed, it shows we can tend to lose our sight in focus. And here's how I see the dangers of swinging too far. I think it leads us to understand that our faith, our pistis, can be relegated to some sort of a transactional event that requires nothing more of action or life impact other than a badge or a label that we adhere to. I believe born out of this is the nominal Christian. And I think when we put either of these sides of the coin into full focus, it eclipses the view of the other side. And then we can begin to miss the mark. On one side, it leads to this unhealthy view that to be made right with God requires us to achieve some sort of status with Him in what we do, or we work to earn it, or we induce feelings of failure and shame when we can't measure up. And this becomes the worldview in which we see our relationship with God. And then on the other side of the coin, we relegate the Christian faith to some sort of exchange or transaction that provides us with a benefit. It's a label or badge that we wear. It requires nothing of us but a simple acknowledgement or belief. And it leads us to a shallow, half-hearted understanding of our faith that costs us very little and is ripe with hypocrisy. And if we were very honest, might I gently suggest that this would be an apt criticism of the modern church that has emerged in our lifetimes. But I think the reality is that what Paul envisioned was neither of these things. The only thing Paul envisions when he called the church to respond with pistis, with faith, was a wholehearted response of relational trust that represented a covenant of commitment, that represented a shifting of allegiances and a fidelity. Of course, this includes our beliefs, but was so much more. Pistis was discovered in the faithfulness that Jesus lived, and to embrace that was to follow into His example. Let me ask you an honest question. If each of us actually followed in the faithfulness of Jesus, what would His church look like? I think it would be the most compelling picture of generosity and sacrifice and humility and service, marked by extravagant love that would be both unstoppable in this mission, because these things are not things that can be taken away from us, and it would be attractive to all. Is that the church that we discover? So observation 1, we have no words. Observation number 2, focus makes a difference. And I want to leave you with one final observation. This one may be a bit more personal. Observation number 3, faith rises above our beliefs. I have certainly mentioned this before, but the writings of Mother Teresa had a pretty profound shaping on my life and the direction of it during my mid-20s, which is longer ago than I care to admit. But very fascinating to me are the private and personal writings that have surfaced more recently, emerging only after her death. A collection of very personal and vulnerable letters written to only her closest of confidants over the course of decades of her life, revealing that there was a deep and inner struggle in the midst of what we all know to be her life's work of service to the poor. After what she took to be a calling from God, she made a private vow to give herself completely to Him, no matter what, and to serve Him among the poorest of the poor, which we watched her life live out with remarkable faithfulness. But what appeared from her private writings is she not only experienced the felt absence of God during these times, she also experienced tremendous doubt, and a doubt to a sort of degree it almost feels incompatible with belief. Listen to some of her words. "There is no one to answer my prayers," she wrote. "So many unanswered questions live within me. I'm afraid to uncover them because of the blasphemy. If there be a God, please forgive me. In my soul, I feel just that terrible pain of loss, of God not wanting me, of God not being God, of God not really existing, the darkness that surrounds me on all sides. I speak of love for souls, of tender love for God, but these words pass through my lips, and I long with a deep longing to believe them." So how do we make sense of these words? Early on, she described herself as having lost her faith. "Where is my faith?" she wrote. "Even deep down, right in there, is nothing but emptiness and darkness. My God, how painful is this unknown pain?" I suppose it isn't difficult to understand some of these raw emotions given her profound experience and engagement with pain and disease and death and suffering and the most broken images of humanity. And then there are these 9 words she penned that leave a distinct impression on me. She said this, to live by faith and yet not to believe. And in reading those, it leaves me wondering this question in the face of what we've talked about today. Is this someone who lacked faith in God? Or alternatively, is this someone who had a profound faith in God? I think why it hits me on a more personal note is that I can relate to the struggle at times to make sense of the world that I engage with. Sometimes my beliefs don't all neatly fit well into the world that I see, or the pain and the suffering that we witness. Sometimes my beliefs seem to be incongruent with the reality around me. Sometimes we find ourselves saying, God, you seem so absent in places of great suffering or loss. The honesty of these words seem rather reflective to the honesty we see in much of the poetry of the Psalms, doesn't it? But this is what's so profound to me in discovering these writings of Mother Teresa. In the midst of these words, for decades, was the most remarkable picture to me of faithfulness, of allegiance, of putting a relational, wholehearted loyalty into following into the faithfulness of Jesus, even when the beliefs didn't seem to stay in tow. Pistis, faith, rises above belief. Church, the faith that Paul speaks of as he writes to the Church of Rome is not found in some sort of singular cognitive event or an emotional moment of belief. It's not a transaction that we make or some sort of passive disposition we carry or a label we wear, but rather it's found in the active and ongoing allegiance and fidelity and faithfulness in which we follow Jesus into the faithfulness he lived out at the cross. Far too often we have made Christianity into something else. But as we dig into this lost treasure, I believe we discover what it was Paul was calling the church towards. Don't get me wrong, he was clearly not saying, let's double down on what you're doing and attempt to earn or appease God in some way by doing the right things. But pistis, faith, as it was understood, had no context for anything but an active and present tense trust in the faithfulness of Jesus that demonstrates into our lives by wholehearted allegiance in following him. Maybe in the end, Webster's dictionary gets our theology better than we often do. I was rather surprised, but when I looked up the definition of faith, the primary meaning was allegiance or duty to a person. And the secondary meaning was belief in the traditional doctrines of a religion. I think too often we approach it with the reverse.